We're living at the moment in a time of riots. This was something that was said by Alain Badiou, a French philosopher, in 2011, but it's even more true today. Why did Alain Badiou say this? He said it because all over the world, practically every country, there is some kind of popular mobilization going on. There is some kind of rioting, there's some kind of social movement on the streets, there's something underway. Now, what Badiou thinks it is different from what other people think, but he thinks that it's something to do with people who have been left out of the global system. He calls them the inexistent, the people who don't exist. And when they riot or when they get on the streets, what they're doing is they're coming into existence. Other people would dispute that point. They would say, yes, it's a time of mobilizations, but it's not always about the people who don't exist, whose voices have been up till now kept silent. There's movements going on now for example, in Brazil, which is about the middle classes complaining about corruption. So it's not all about the totally oppressed. But amongst the oppressed, what you're talking about is people who are living increasingly precarious lives, who have moved into big cities all across the world, and they are finding that they're struggling to make a living and nobody can hear them. Well, what popular mobilization studies or paying attention to this question can give you is a sense of what ordinary people are thinking. We call it the pulse of the street. And what people are thinking, their grievances, their desires, their disputes, is very often very different from what the mainstream media is thinking, from what the government policy speakers are thinking. And so it can be really useful to understand what the masses of people and what big sections of society have got in their heads and how that differs from what you might say the mainstream setters of the discourse, what they are thinking is true and real. Well, popular mobilization is something that is outside of formal spaces. So if you have an example of people going to Parliament or going to your local council and making a fuss about something, we don't consider that in this particular way of looking at things to be popular mobilization. What we're talking about is where people are getting together and they're complaining or they are making claims and they're doing it outside of what we call formal spaces. So they're doing it on the streets. They're doing it in the big squares in the center of Athens or Cairo. You will have a sense of unpredictability because it will have been repressed or kept silent. People will be having these discussions, but they won't be doing anything about it. They'll just be having the discussions, and then suddenly something will spark it off, and they will pour out onto the streets or into the main squares of the cities, and that's when things can get a little bit frightening. Governments, people in authority, don't like it when populations, particularly large numbers of people, decide that they need a voice and they need to use channels that are different from the formal channels of elections and consultative spaces. So they tend to try to prevent people from protesting. Or if they do have space for protest, they tend to try to organise it in such a way as its dangers are limited, its ability to destabilise the status quo is reduced. And this is quite understandable because popular protest is often very unpredictable. It arises out of a lot of low-level disputes and debates that are going on, as I said, all over the place. And then suddenly, they may suddenly emerge onto the streets, and governments don't like this. But what we're seeing is that this hasn't made a huge amount of difference to the tendency to mobilise. People mobilise by whatever means, whether they're talking to each other face-to-face at the bus stop or they're talking to each other on social media. it's still a process whereby ultimately the popular mobilization begins to take place in the public space by whatever means. Why do popular mobilizations happen? Well, as I've said, it's partly to do with the fact that formal spaces aren't offering people the answers to the issues that they're finding of importance. So if you're thinking about all those people in the world, masses, hundreds of millions of people who are living very precarious lives, very uncertain incomes, very difficult conditions that they live in, they feel that they're not listened to. Well, sometimes it can be just a spark that is something that insults people so much that they just say, right, it's time to go out. There's nothing more to lose. And that might be, for example, an extrajudicial killing. A person gets killed, for example, by the police, and out pours everybody onto the streets. But it might also be a long, slow process of the revelations of corruption. It might be something that is a mixture of social movements which are organised and ordinary people who are not organised, but they come together to complain about the way global capitalism is changing the world that they know. So it's all about grievance, but it's also about change that people are demanding. Another big cause that we've noticed is this idea of what E.P. Thompson in 1971, he was talking about the 18th century in Britain, he called the moral economy. When the relations between the rich and the poor, they're set up in such a way that the poor will accept a certain amount of being downtrodden. And then there comes a point where they just say, no more, because something's changing in the relations between rich and poor. And in terms of food, for example, we've found a lot of instances of popular mobilization where something changes in terms of the price of food or the availability of the real basic essentials for life. And if that changes and people say, hold on, this is not what this is not the deal. We're no longer going to put up with this. And they get involved in popular mobilization. During a mobilization, during the times in which they get really active, people will have whole sets of new ideas. They'll have new vocabularies. They'll have a sense that things could be different. And this is the very exciting moments that you'll see. And this is when the media will pick it up. And this is when people will think, oh, this is the time that a new world may be born. But after the mobilization, after the most exciting parts, everything dies down again. And then what happens? During and after, the first thing that can happen is a very harsh response from the state or from the authorities, who may be trying to suppress the dangerous elements of a popular mobilization, the sense of violence that it can create. So they will reply in a way to try and, first of all, keep it under control, but also to respond with violence. These events that take place around the world, that are taking place now but have taken place for centuries, they can, as Veena Das puts it, they can be critical events. They can create changes that last for decades, if not centuries afterwards. So some of the dramatic events that she talks about, which are actually forms of popular mobilization, is like partition in India, or also in India, the times when people mobilized about the burning of young women on their husbands' funeral pyres. That when these mobilizations happened and people brought forward their fury about these processes, what happened was there was changes in the society, in the way society did things, in its laws and its institutions, that the society never went back to before that, after that event. Something else that happens after popular mobilization is that, going back to Badiou, the inexistence, that which nobody had paid attention to, comes into attention and it remains there. So, like, for example, you have what's just been happening in the United States with the killings of young black men. What happened when those killings occurred and afterwards was that people poured out their fury at what was going on. And the Black Lives Matter movement just fought its way into the kind of media profile. It was noticed. And what they were saying was that the civil rights movement, which in its time had done the same thing, had become bloated and ineffectual, and that now we needed a new way of thinking about how race was happening in the United States. Then another aftermath of popular mobilization can be a state of sadness, a state whereby everything that people thought that they had seen and glimpsed disappears again. If you think about, or you meet some of the people who were in Tahrir Square, you will find amongst many of them a certain sense of sadness, co-option of the moment by people who are organized, people who are powerful, or simply a return to something we had before, so that the explosion also gives a chance for more reactionary forces to come into the space that's been made by the disturbance of popular mobilization, and actually to take things backwards, at least in terms of what the popular mobilizations were hoping for. In the reading pack, we've given you 6 readings. There's a mass of wonderful stuff to read, and each one of these readings leads you into a whole different set of possible readings that you might do after that. But we've tried to cover the main points here. So we started with Tilly and Tarot, who talk about contentious politics. And what Tilly and Tarot do for you is they give you a way of taking popular mobilization and also social movement activities and categorizing them, seeing what's happening. Very often they're talking in the forms of theatre. They talk about contentious performances. They talk about repertoires. So it's a way of understanding and breaking down what is happening in popular mobilization. Then we have a reading from Jessica Horn, who links you into a whole set of readings about gender and popular mobilization. Now, she's talking about not only popular mobilization in favour of gender equity, but also the genderedness of mobilization, what happens inside mobilizations, how women and men behave differently and have different repertoires and treat one another differently, sometimes quite badly, inside popular movements. And then the third reading is Patta Chatterjee, and it's a reading which describes his notion of political society. Now, why did we put that in? In the actual reading, you don't see much popular mobilization. What you see is a version of how life is for those masses of people that I mentioned at the beginning, who are very often the ones who are furious enough and have little enough to lose to become the foot soldiers of popular mobilizations, of riots in particular. But Patta Chatterjee gives us a wonderful explanation of just how life is for most of the people in most of the world, in terms of living in slums and urban informal settlements, and the ways in which they have a means of having voice in the state, which are always they're not direct. You can't go and talk to the local council because you're not a person of importance. And so how do you speak? The fourth reading is Akshay Khanna and colleagues of his, and it's about unruly politics. Unruly politics is another way of talking about popular mobilization, but it's a particular way which we've been working on here at the Institute of Development Studies, and Akshay has been working on from his base in Delhi in India. And what he's talking about is a kind of politics beyond the politics of politicians and elected chambers and so on. It's the politics of the street. And he will take it and he will give you examples in this particular piece of writing, but he will also take it into the philosophical realm. And that's where you can get your links into Alain Badiou and Jacques Rancière and those who take us deeply into what is it that people are doing in their struggles against the power of the state and authority. And then finally, as an antidote to the deep philosophy of unruly politics, we turn to Duncan Green and a short video in which he talks about recent mobilizations and calls for power to pay attention to the ills of society, and he stresses the idea of active citizenship. What he's saying is that people who mobilize are being active citizens, and there are ways in which they can be active citizens and they can be heard, and there are ways in which they can be engaged with, and in which you get democracy. And there are ways in which active citizenship can become, the only route for it is violence, and the only route for it is informal mobilization. But he's saying if you pay attention to the possibilities of active citizenship, then there are many, many opportunities for drawing on this as a form of democracy.